Entrepreneurship, you can find at almost every university or college now. It's very sexy. Everybody wants to build a business, grow a business, scale a business, sell a business. But for some reason, family business is not seen in that same way. Family business is not small business. Family business is not all fighting and conflict. That family businesses actually drive the world economy. While money can certainly exaggerate an issue, ultimately the origin has nothing to do with money. It has to do with you and me. It has to do with the emotional. We had a trust, you broke that trust, and that's going to have significant consequences. Family's always a challenge for people, no matter where you are. And I use the example of, I'm not from a family business myself because I would never want to be in business with my brother. But then we look at sort of a cultural overlay. So India fits very much in what we would call an honor culture, very similar to Latin America.
Welcome to the Masters Union podcast. Today we have with us Professor Dan, who teaches strategic leadership for family business at Masters Union. With over 20 years of experience, Professor Dan is also the executive director of Smith Family Business Initiative at Cornell University. Welcome to the podcast, Dan.
Thank you.
Now, you teach strategic leadership for family business at Masters Union, right? Now, this is a very niche topic. I would love to understand, for our audience, your career journey and how did you end up teaching a course on family business?
It really was by accident, to be honest. This was not a career or an expertise that I set out to explore. Mm-hmm. Prior to Cornell, I was working at the University of Vermont in the US and discovered family business through the dean of the business school, who at the time wanted somebody to run an existing program there. And I said, sure, why not? At that point, I knew nothing about family business, but it really took root in me. I loved the fact that it had often very little to do about business and more to do about the individual and the person and the interactions that they had both with their family as well as those within the organization. From that point, spent a number of years at the University of Vermont growing that program, which led to me joining Cornell in 2014. Cornell received a significant gift to create a family business program, primarily for the reason that family business in the US and even globally to an extent at the university level is not a very highly studied area. So entrepreneurship, you can find at almost every university or college now. It's very sexy. Everybody wants to build a business, grow a business, scale a business, sell a business. And the universities want to take credit for all of that if they can. But for some reason, family business is not seen in that same way. For whatever reason, sustaining a business for generations, often for 25, 50, 100 years, doesn't have the same appeal as entrepreneurship. And we're trying to change that. So the Smith Family Business Initiative was created to address the fact that many of our students come from family business. Of course, we have a very global population at Cornell. And these students come from places like India, like China, like Latin America. And for them, family business is incredibly important. So what we do and what my role in that is to help build the knowledge around family business, help to teach the next generation of family business leaders, and also just to raise awareness that family business is not small business. Family business is not all fighting and conflict, that family businesses actually drive the world economy, that they are the predominant form of business virtually no matter where you go. And if that's the case, we should know more about them. We should know how these businesses survive. We should know how they succeed. And we should help the individuals that are in those family businesses hopefully make better choices. Because for most students, especially students here at Masters Union or students back at Cornell, if there is a family business in their family, chances are one of the number one choices they have to make is what role will I play in that family business? So I've had the great pleasure of doing this for the last 20 years of my career, meeting phenomenal people, both students, business owners, from around the world who have succeeded in this. Some have failed in it. And I've tried to sort of aggregate that knowledge into what I teach.
And will you say that this course is only designed for students who have a family business, or is it also helpful for students who don't have a family business?
We like to say, or I personally like to say, that this course is for anyone who works in, for, or with a family business. So globally, anywhere between 70 and 90% of all businesses are family owned. And that number actually goes even higher here in India and parts of Latin America. So by that metric, many of your students undoubtedly come from family business. However, many might work in a family business, in human resources, in management of some sort, marketing, operations, you name it. And others might work with family business. And by that, I mean, they could be a consultant. They could be an advisor. They could be an investment banker of some sort. So we really try to tailor the course around that sort of mantra, anyone who works in, for, or with a family business. And I think in the class that I've been teaching, we've seen that. Of the 30 or so students, I'd say about 2/3 have indicated some connection to their family's business. But the others are aspiring entrepreneurs. Others are thinking of advising or consulting. I think one student has a placement at Bain later this year. So these are principles, these are tools, these are frameworks that I think will help all of those people, whether it's you dealing with your own family, whether it's you sitting down at the table and having to deal with a family in that regard, or you're the one who's assigned to sort of work inside the business and figure out, when the next kid knocks at the door and says he wants a job, do you just give him one because he's part of the family?
And that makes me curious, right? Like when you look at businesses, and a lot of big conglomerates in India are family businesses, right? You might think that, hey, running a business or a family business is the same, right? So what do you cover in your course that makes it a unique course and not a normal business course?
Yeah. So sometimes using the word business is almost a misnomer because it has more to do, I would argue, with the individual within the business than the business itself. We don't get a lot into business strategy per se. We don't pull out spreadsheets and look at the numbers. This is really more about the individual within the system. So we start with a concept called the 3-circle model, a very simple Venn diagram that looks at family, business, and ownership. If you can picture those 3 circles overlapping, that helps the individual locate where they are. Are you a member of the family? Yes. Are you just working in the business? Yes. Are you part of an ownership group in that business? And for some, there's overlap. You could be a family member working there. You could be a family member who has ownership. You could be an employee who might have ownership in some capacity. So that's sort of a starting point. But then we start to look at other variables, such as culture. We spend a day just looking at the various forms of culture, both here in India, in Asia, Latin America, and the U.S., because there's some differences there as well that are particular. We spend a day looking at values, both your own personal values and how they might align with some of the choices you'll need to make, as well as what are the family values. For the businesses that we explore in this course, all of them can very well articulate their business values and how they translate into how they operate. We even look at innovation in a family business. Family businesses certainly have the reputation of being maybe slow to change, could be insular. This is the way we've always done it. Why do we need to change? But I think the misconception there is that family businesses actually are a great place for innovation. When run properly, when alignment between ownership and management is close, they can make decisions very quickly. They don't have to go through multiple levels of governance. They might not have a corporate board structure that requires them to have committees and meetings just to make a simple decision. So we look at all of this, and we really explore the fact that for family businesses, complexity grows over time. So take any typical family, starts with mom and dad. They have a few children. Those children have children. And then those children have children. And if you do that math in your head, it doesn't take long before you have 20, 30, 50 possible family members in some capacity that are trying to figure out who owns this business, how do we run this business, how do I get out of this business, and what is this business going to do for me? So really sort of looking at that lifestyle, or I should say that life cycle of the business and the family, because they're not always in unison. Families tend to grow at an exponential rate. Businesses tend to grow at a linear rate. And there's a point in there where families need to start making decisions around what their role in the business is going to be.
And you mentioned about, looking at different kinds of regions, whether it's India, Latin America, US. So how have you found Indian businesses to be different than the rest of the world? Are any specific examples in that?
There's many. So, I'd start first by saying there are similarities for family businesses everywhere. They're all going to be challenged with succession. Who's coming into the business? Do I want to do this? Is the business itself something that we want to bring forward? Has it changed and adapted and grown with time? Family's always a challenge for people, no matter where you are. And I use the example of, I'm not from a family business myself because I would never want to be in business with my brother. So that's sort of the starting point is, what is the same no matter where you go? This is not an easy thing for any family. But then we look at sort of a cultural overlay. So India fits very much in what we would call an honor culture, very similar to Latin America. And by honor culture, what we mean there is a very close association with family. Often there's a deference to the senior generation. And I see this play out both here as well as with my students back at Cornell. The Indian students that I get to interact with, they have a much more positive affiliation with the family and by extension, the family business, if there is one. They often have a much clearer expectation of what their role might be, and returning to the family business. While there are always individual choices involved, that's often something that's viewed as a positive longer-term goal. From where I come from in the U.S., we're very much what we would call an individualist culture. It's all about the self. Decision making is what I get to do, and that's why we value entrepreneurship so highly in the U.S. For a lot of the students from North American, U.S. kind of individualist culture, returning to the family business is seen as not a desired choice. I don't want to be seen as going back to the business. I want to be seen as working at Amazon or working at Google, going on Wall Street, making a lot of money, being very proud and doing this all on my own, even though we never really do it all on our own. And then through much of Asia, we see this respect culture. Meaning there's a high level of deference to the senior generation. Often for individuals from that culture, there's a lot of conflict with the choice. They are expected to return to the business, and they're expected, they're almost obliged to. But for many of them, they might not want to return because it's either a very traditional, maybe manufacturing, not such a glamorous career choice type thing. They might have experienced life in Western cultures and want to take more advantage of that. So we look at that cultural overlay. So that's a long way to answer your question around for family businesses here. I think what we're seeing is there's a lot of tradition. But there's also a lot of change. We've seen the role of females in family business begin to grow, which is an incredibly positive sign. And in my class, I have five, maybe six females. All have very entrepreneurial ideas. We had a guest in our class yesterday, owns a hotel and several restaurants down in Mumbai. A.B. Kohli, I think is his name. He talked about he has one child. He's third generation in his family's business, and his child's a daughter. For her, he wants her to explore what she wants to do. There's not an expectation that she will return, but if she wants to, that's a choice. So I think we're seeing this shift of a high level of expectation, often preferred to the male, often the oldest male.
Yeah.
But we are seeing more and more, I think businesses realize that things are changing. And for these businesses to grow and scale and possibly even become more global, they'll have to match what the expectation is globally. So I think that's a very positive sign. I've seen that kind of play out in the class, both through the examples we've shared as well as the discussions we've had.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree with it, right? So if you look at the last 5 years, whether it's Ambani's or Birla's or Nadar's, you have seen women, children come up and take the leadership positions, right? So I think that's something to be proud of.
Absolutely.
Now, if again on comparison between East and West, you see a lot of big companies and big conglomerates being family businesses in the East, whether it's South Korea, whether it's China, whether it's India. Whereas in the West, your big companies are entrepreneur-led companies, right? So why? Is it the government? Is it the culture? What is it that causes the big businesses to be family-run businesses in the East?
So I would say probably first and foremost, there's a trust factor. So there's a high level of trust in the family. And sometimes that level of trust doesn't match the government or the rule of law. And so the family plays a key role in stabilizing that level of trust. The larger businesses here in India, as well as in parts of Asia and even Latin America, they retain family ownership, even though they have often some form of public ownership.
Yeah.
So they might have some form of stock. And they can protect family ownership by offering different classes of stock, sort of an A and B stock, a voting versus non-voting. They can retain family influence by having key members on the board. So the family might have board representation that they can trust, sort of a voting block mentality, if you will. And so what it does is it allows them to operate very much as a global corporation. They can do business globally. They have business practices that are very current and very modern. But it still is a family-owned or what we call a family controlled business. So, for instance, one example we looked at in class is Havels of India. This is a third generation, actually second generation going into the third generation. They have a share of public ownership. And Anhil uses the example of in the early days, the business serves the family, meaning a family starts a business because they want to put food on the table, they want to make money, they want to own property or whatever, and that's good up to a point. But then as the business grows, as more family members begin to join the business, there's a shift that happens in there where the family then needs to serve the business. So Anhil, talks about the family being a steward of the business. So what has happened in this example is the family involvement directly in the business, meaning running and managing the business, is pretty limited, if not almost down to just one person, Anhil. But the family still retains ownership and will be active in places like the board and just being sort of the spokespeople and or sort of the name behind the business. So, and this is very common, especially in Latin America as well. We see this play out. To a smaller extent, we see it in the U.S. So businesses like Walmart, businesses like Ford are still considered family owned, even though these are large multi-generational conglomerates, and they often look and act very much like a corporate business. And you or I could participate in their stock and ownership. But the family still retains a significant amount of control at the board and or voting level.
Understood. Got it. And family businesses have their own set of challenges, whether it's succession planning, whether it's the level of corporate governance. So give us some examples of good succession planning versus some bad. It could be any part of the world, right? But what differentiates a good succession versus a bad succession?
Yeah. So we talk about a concept called governance. And I personally talk about little g governance and big G governance. So little g is sort of the informal governance. It's sitting down with your mom or dad and having the conversation about the business. Hey, are there any expectations for me to join the business? When do you think, you're going to leave the business? Having some of these conversations, which, for you and me seem very simple, but those can be big questions often to ask. And I'm still shocked how many times these very simple conversations don't have. But one student in the class shared a perfect example of this is that, he and his dad have regular sit-down talks, and he is free to ask almost any question. There's a level of trust there. And he asked all of these types of questions, like, what's the future of the business? What role might I play? Can I own this business one day? So that's, I think, where success starts, is having those conversations both between generations, often between siblings. If we think of multiple siblings, is one better suited for a future in the business? What are their particular interests or skills? What if one's working in the business versus not working in the business? How do we sort of reconcile some of those differences that might occur? But as the business grows and as the family grows, again, through generations and through time, complexity is going to grow. So that informal conversation, that those informal decisions that happen need to become more formalized. So we begin talking about things like a board of advisors or a board of directors, which is even more formal. We talk about things like a family constitution, a family employment policy. And this is, on one hand, these are all tools that if you look at any successful business, they have versions of these. But for families, because there are so many unspoken rules, within any family, within your family, within my family, there are birth order rules, there are gender rules, there are, mom and dad might have a favorite. They might not ever say it, but, maybe we all know this. Wasn't me, I know that. But once you start sort of putting some formalization behind that, for some families, that's very uncomfortable. If I hand you a sheet of paper and say, okay, these are the rules we need to abide by now. Some people will say, well, I don't know about that. So I think what's important is the process by which the family comes to that. This is not just mom or dad coming out with a sheet of paper and saying, okay, here's what the rules we're going to live by now. Here's how we're going to operate as a family. Here's how we're going to operate as a business. Here's, who owns it and how we're going to make decisions there. It's really more the aggregation of all those conversations we had, the little g conversations, into the big G, that begins to structure what the business is going to look and feel and operate like. It's going to eliminate confusion over, can I work in the business? Do I get a job simply because my last name is the same as what's on the door? Or is there a process? Is somebody going to interview me? Are they going to create a job for me just because I am a family member? And even if I do work there, what does that journey look like? Is there a process for me to move up through leadership and maybe become the president or CEO one day? All of these things can be spelled out and stipulated. Do I need to go get a college degree? Do I need outside experience? Can I sell my share of the business? What if I don't want to play in the business and I just want whatever that money might be? So all of these things need to be spelled out, because if they're not spelled out, one of those children is going to come knocking on the door and want a job. And for any business, obviously you want to hire the best, you want to hire qualified people. But if you're not prepared to say no, then you're going to end up with family members who can ultimately affect the morale of the company if they come in and they're not performing. They're ultimately can affect the morale of the family. Why did that person get a job and I don't? Absolutely. Why is that person being promoted and I'm not? And ultimately, it's going to affect the ownership of the business
and the performance of the business.
So going back to those 3 circle models, this governance exists in all 3 of those circles. In the family circle, we might see something like a family council or a family meeting. And this is gathering all the members of the family, whether you work in the business or not.
Or whether you own it or not.
spouses, children.
Yeah.
All of this can be stipulated, but it's important to share that information for mom and dad to say, look, we're going to sell this business in 5 years, or we need another CEO, and here's how we're going to go about doing that. In the ownership circle, that can be a very small circle. It might be one person, but it could be multiple people if we're a third or fourth generation family business, and others have come in through various means. And this is where we make decisions on ownership. Are we buying new business? Are we selling? How are we going to operate? What's our strategy? Do we have a board of directors? This would be the governance that exists there. And then, of course, within the business, this is the operating unit that really started it all. You have your management and governance there. So that's what the best family businesses do. They have governance, they have decision-making, they have a way of doing business in all of those circles. We also talk about these as rooms. There's a family room, a board room, a management room, and an owner's room. And in each of those places, there are different decisions, different roles, and different people. And sometimes for family businesses, it helps to understand which room you are in at any given time.
And I think it's also a lot of expectation setting, right?
Yes.
Like we do with employees in different businesses. You lay down the career path. You say that, hey, this is the role, this is the expectation. And if you perform to this level, that's what the next level looks like. And I think it's important to do that in a family business as well, so that none of the members take it for granted. Right.
Swati, that's 100% correct. And that's, I will use that example often. If this person wasn't your son or daughter, what would you be doing differently? If this was just somebody who came in through the door, said, I want a job, I want to do this with the company. You're more inclined to do it if it's your child, obviously. But what's the framework you're applying to that decision? And that's 100% correct, is adding some level of formality, as unnatural as it might feel for some families, is going to avoid a lot of issues and conflicts and emotional turmoil down the road.
Yeah. And I think what is most important is the emotional turmoil, because if you let an employee go, right, at some level, he or she's going to forget it and going to move on in life. But if this is your family member, it's going to affect the personal life as well, right? And that brings me to dispute resolution. What have been some of the scenarios where you've seen family businesses handle it really well?
Yeah. Herein lies the crux of family business, right? The overlay of emotion and business. And this is why these courses exist. So who's handled it well? I would say, first, those families that have a lot of this governance in place have a lot of these decisions made ahead of time. So for instance, let's say you've got 3 siblings that own a business. They each have a spouse. Male or female, doesn't matter. And one of the siblings dies unexpectedly. Okay. What happens to that ownership for that member? If that's not determined ahead of time, all of a sudden you have we'll say they're non-family, even though they're married, but they're not part of the family owning that owns the business. Now you have a dynamic where you've got somebody else sitting at the table who's not part of your family. They could be a great person.
Correct.
They could not be a great person. And this, these are what movies are made out of, right?
True.
Mommy Dearest is a great example of this. So to handle that properly, a lot of families might put in something called a buy-sell agreement. I'm not sure if there's a similar mechanism here in India, but buy-sell just basically is often an instrument that says, in the event of this triggering incident, a death, disability, or some other calamity that befalls an individual, here's how we will perform. So we will use life insurance to make sure that the spouse is taken care of financially. So we will essentially buy that share back from the family member. And it's up to the family to stipulate, do the next generation get an opportunity to participate in ownership? So sometimes it will by default go down to the next generation, and that keeps it in the family per se. So that's, I think, one area where families that think this out ahead of time, that have the proper legal arrangements in place, can avoid a really unfortunate situation. It also helps in the event of, let's say, a death. It also helps the family to grieve properly. They don't have to worry about what's going to happen in that ugly situation. On the flip side of that, I've seen other scenarios where families just can't agree. And let's use an example of two families that have 50% ownership in the same business. And one family is actively running and managing the business. The other family is what we would call passive owners, meaning they're just getting the dividends, they're reaping the benefits of ownership without like really putting anything else into the business. And I've seen this scenario play out where that passive side of the family, there's an opportunity to sell. And that's their prerogative. There's a value there and they want to capitalize on that value. Whereas the other side of the family said, no, we like running this and we want to continue.
We're emotionally invested.
Absolutely.
In this. Yeah.
That's a great way of putting it. And in that situation, and this is, a real scenario, there was conflict. And through a lot of consternation, the family retained the one side of the family retained ownership. They bought out the other side, but they had to sell assets. They had to sell property and real estate. And that came at great emotional cost. And quite possibly, those families will have some issues moving forward.
Of course.
So this, I think, is one of the maybe kind of minor tragedies of family business is sometimes these choices are made, be they good or bad. And they can cause rifts in the family. They can cause divides. As one business owner put it to me, there's a few empty chairs around the family table. Meaning, these are sometimes difficult choices you make to either preserve the business and or preserve the family. And that's, I think sort of the tough part of family business is that these choices do get made and they do have real life consequences with often emotional turmoil that goes along with it.
And what is surprising to me is that irrespective of the size of business, I've seen these disputes come in very small properties versus as big as, the Ambani brothers, which we all know about.
Man, you're reading my answer sheet, aren't you?
So I haven't.
There's actually a great book by a Cornell professor, Carl Pilmer, and it's called Fault Lines. And it deals specifically with this, what you're talking about, is that, and I use the concept in class that while money can certainly exaggerate an issue, a family issue, an emotional issue, ultimately the origin has nothing to do with money. It has to do with you and me. It has to do with the emotional. We had a trust. You broke that trust, and that's going to have significant consequences. And Carl uses an example of, mom and dad have died. We're dividing up, plates and furniture and things that are in the house. Somebody takes the cherished china or silverware. Like, why do you get it and I don't get it? And seemingly very little monetary value. It's the emotional attachment to that. In my own family, I had a situation with my brother at the passing of my mother that was dealt with probably $10,000 US. And because of the way it was handled, and I'm not blaming fault on either side, that created a rift between my brother and I. Had nothing to do with the money, but it was the emotional, the emotional sort of, trauma that I experienced through that. And so you're 100% right that this can happen in a small, little roadside stand family business. This can happen all the way up through, the largest ones. The whole TV show Succession is built on this, right?
Correct.
If you've watched that, these are, while that's a very dramatic series, a lot of those issues are very real. I think the money and the level of wealth only amplifies the problem, but the origin of it often is at the gut level.
Awesome. Now, switching gears a little bit from corporate governance and succession to innovation, right? Now, I meet a lot of students who, who have that fire in the belly of taking the family business to the next level. But at the same time, you do have, for the current ecosystem building up, a lot of tech startups coming up and disrupting the incumbent family businesses, right? So how have you seen some of these new generations to come and actually be able to withstand the pressure of the competition?
So I think this is one of the things that's often misunderstood about family business. I think people hear that term and they have, an idea that, this is the restaurant or, the hardware store, or whatever, that it's a sort of singular unit. But when I talk about family business, I talk about really the span from entrepreneur all the way through, a multi-generational 100-plus-year-old business. And by that, I mean what I'm seeing with the current generation, and I'm seeing this play out in this class right here at Masters Union. Very often the family business, if you will, provides an avenue for that level of entrepreneurship and exploration. So I've got one student from her family business, but she's got a very clear idea of doing something different. She's got a startup idea. And so what's great here is that the family can provide an environment for that entrepreneurship to take place. She grew up probably with entrepreneurial parents. She saw, what it took to run a business. So that's already pre-programmed in her. She will probably draw on resources of the family. That might mean some startup capital. That might mean some intellectual capital. That might mean, hey, I need somebody to do my books for me, or I need somebody to help me sell this. So
Correct.
Often the first people you turn to are those family members. And then it's access to business networks, or it's, I need a physical place to run this because we're really starting to grow now. In all of these areas, family play a much more important role than institutional support for entrepreneurship. And I think that's something that gets greatly overlooked when we talk about family business. I'll give a few other examples. These are non-Indian, but a former student at Cornell. Her family, Asian family business, was in property management. Had extensive business in Singapore, but she had a very different path for her. She wanted to be an entrepreneur, but she drew upon the resources and the knowledge that she gained from that family business. And she created her own business, which is essentially, I'll call it a high-end Airbnb. So she had property management experience and knowledge. She had the network needed, and she has essentially created a business that helps those with high-end properties maybe realize some revenue when they're not staying there. A lot of these places remain vacant for much of the year.
Correct.
So that's one great example of very much drawing upon resources from the family business, but doing her own thing and kind of creating her own path. And I think for this generation of students, your students here at Masters Union, they live in a very different world than, maybe what I grew up in. They have access to global markets through the internet. Much more business is online now through commerce and fintech. So the possibilities are endless, and we're seeing some great ideas come out of that. One cautionary tale, and we actually just covered this in class yesterday. The failure rate for tech startups is highest amongst all types of businesses. So failure rates for all startups is close to 90% in the first year. And of those 90%, tech startups have the highest failure rate. So those are always sort of the most attractive. I want to build a new app, a new service, a new, sharing platform, whatever. But those are often the hardest to really get going because they require widespread adoption. They require, some pretty serious levels of expertise. So the opportunities are there, but, also it's not easy as well.
Now, over years, Dan, you have taught so many students. How is your experience different at Masters Union?
So what I really like here is that this is a school of practice and application. The very nature of most of the masters that you bring, if you will. These are CEOs, CMOs, CIOs. These are people who are living it and doing it and breathing it. So they teach from a place of experience, which is very much in my mindset. I myself, I'm not a researcher. I'm not, somebody who I understand the theory, but I don't necessarily teach from it.
Yeah.
My experience comes from 20 years of working with family businesses, talking with students, talking with owners, and just hearing these stories and realizing, there are things that do work. There are things that don't work. And there are, ways that families can be successful. So that's very much what and how I teach. So I think there was a good fit when I decided to come and teach here. And I think the experience has underscored that.
Well, thank you. That's good to know, Dan. I learned a lot about family business today, and I hope our audiences learned a lot as well. Thanks for your time, Dan.
Swati, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Same here.